The market town of Flaxfield prided itself on being the sort of place where very little occurred before breakfast, and certainly nothing worth remarking on. Even the milk deliveries were conducted with such unobtrusive modesty that newcomers sometimes assumed their bottles replenished themselves by some quiet, natural process of rural condensation, which is why Mr. Edwin Carberry, caretaker of All Saints' Church for 32 years and proud possessor of a face that looked permanently dusted with hymn-book powder, found himself in something of a moral quandary at precisely 4:22 a.m. on a damp Wednesday morning. He had risen, as usual, to warm the church for the early service. The boiler in the vestry had moods, and Edwin understood its temperament much as a shepherd understands a stubborn ram. Gentle coaxing, a muttered oath when needed, and never turning his back too proudly. But as he approached the north door, he saw a light. A soft one, golden, wavering. The unmistakable glow of a single beeswax candle. Now, there were certain parishioners who believed the church was as much theirs as the Almighty's, and thus entered whenever their souls urged. Nevertheless, the door had been locked. Edwin distinctly remembered locking it. He remembered in the way one remembers fastening one's belt before leaving the house, a matter of habit, dignity and insurance against embarrassment. He opened the door quietly. Inside stood Mrs. Lydia Bray, widow of the recently departed Harold Bray, a clerk at the Municipal Archives known for filing documents with nearly spiritual devotion. She was small, thin, draped in a shawl that might once have been fashionable in 1987. Her hands cupped the candle as though sheltering a bird from rain. She was speaking, not praying, speaking, as one speaks to a person positioned just beyond a pillar. You must understand. They would never have listened to me otherwise. And I am sorry, but what else could I have done? Edwin froze in the aisle, surrounded by silent pews, hymn numbers still displaying last Sunday's choices, Love Divine and Blessed are the Pure in Heart, both aggressively uplifting for that hour. Mrs. Bray, he said, as politely as one might greet a sheep in the pulpit. She started, blowing out the candle at once. The church fell back into grey shadows. Oh, Mr. Carberry, I didn't think anyone would be here yet. It's quite early, madam. Yes. Her voice was thin and flat, like paper rubbed too many times. I find early is best. She moved past him with the careful composure of someone recovering from having been caught in a private act. Her shoes made almost no sound on the flagstone floor. The air smelled faintly of candle smoke and cold stone. Edwin watched her step into the misted street and disappear toward All Saints' Lane. By 8 o'clock the story had been told 3 times, once by Edwin to his wife, who made the appropriate small noise expressing worry and interest, once by his wife to her sister, who interpreted the tale as something tragic and romantic, and once by the sister to Mrs. Daphne Lousby in the post office queue, where it immediately shifted from quiet curiosity to something rather scandalous. Not that the scandal was clear. The narrative had, by this point, sprouted a number of enthusiastic but unsupported additions. The widow had been crying. No. She had been laughing strangely. No. She had been kneeling before some secret part of the church not normally visited. And moreover, it had not been a candle at all, but a lantern, or possibly a flaming letter. That none of these details bore any resemblance to the truth was, of course, irrelevant. Stories in Flaxfield did not need to be accurate. They needed only to be interesting enough to repeat. Inspector Purbright heard the matter only indirectly by way of Sergeant Malley, who relayed it while searching for a fountain pen that had been missing since Easter. Seems odd, sir. Middle of the night, candle, muttering. Husband only 2 months gone. Purbright, who was rearranging a stack of crime reports concerning bicycle lights and illegally affixed election posters, nodded. "Grief," he said, "does not always select a convenient hour. No, sir. Though the vicar's insisting the locks are sound, are they?" "According to him, yes." Purbright leaned back in his chair. His expression never gave much away, but his eyes, mild and observant, carried the look of someone placing a small marker in a mental ledger. "You might make a note," he said gently. "Not an investigation, only a note. Let us see whether this is a single morning of reflection or a habit." Malley scribbled, looking relieved not to be dispatched for interviews. Purbright returned to his reports, but the idea lingered. A widow speaking to someone who was not there, or perhaps to someone who had been. In Flaxfield, the difference was often subtler than one liked to admit. There are, broadly speaking, 3 recognized centres of civic communication in Flaxfield: the public house, for declarations made with too much confidence, the parish hall, for declarations made with too little, and the post office, where declarations were made at just the right volume to be overheard without impropriety. On Thursday morning, the queue at the post office stretched back to the door, composed of individuals who had no pressing postal business but had discovered, upon waking, that they needed envelopes, stamps, or in several cases a better look at everyone else. Mrs. Daphne Lowsby, possessor of a voice like a cat approaching a saucer of cream, soft but with fierce intent, was recounting her understanding of the matter to anyone within a 6-foot radius. "Well, of course grief affects people differently," she said, with the solemnity of someone who has never been affected by grief in her life. "But to go wandering about a church before dawn—" "Oh, I think it's terribly sad, and terribly telling." "What does it tell?" asked Mrs. Venn, who always asked questions as though ordering off a menu and hoping to be surprised. "That," said Daphne, leaning in, "she is not at peace with how poor Mr. Bray left this world." There was a synchronized intake of breath from the queue, as though a choir had been rehearsing sorrowful sympathy. "Do you mean she feels responsible?" said Mrs. Venn, eyes widening with the delicate horror of someone who hoped the answer was yes. "Oh, I would never suggest such a thing," said Daphne, which of course meant she absolutely would. "But I have heard her say, more than once, that Harold died without understanding something important. That was enough to ignite a small but stable flame of intrigue throughout Flaxfield. Harold Bray had been, as clerks often are, a man about whom one could say many polite things while thinking nothing at all. He had tended to municipal files with an intensity that suggested emotional investment in alphabetical order. He attended church regularly, nodded to acquaintances without inviting conversation, and once served as secretary to the Rotary Club for a full 7 years without giving evidence of ever having enjoyed it. His sudden passing, after a brief and rather quiet illness, had been mourned with appropriate decency and followed by respectful sighs that life could be terribly unpredictable. Now, unpredictability had been replaced by something far more stimulating: mystery. At the opposite end of the high street, in the snug interior of the honeysuckle tea room, the conversation developed a rather different flavour, lighter, sweeter, and sprinkled with conjecture like icing sugar. Miss Constance Bligh, who taught piano to the children of respectable families and possessed fingers that fluttered when she spoke, gave her opinion to her companion. "Lydia always had a delicacy," she said, stirring her tea, though she had already sweetened it twice. She felt things very deeply. Even before Harold died, you could see some thought weighing on her. "Such as?" asked Mrs. Kett, who never missed an opportunity to collect emotional souvenirs from other people's sadness. "Oh, I wouldn't know," Constance said, clearly knowing. "But I remember she once mentioned that silence in a home can get so too large, as though something is missing where something used to be." Mrs. Kett nodded with tragic sympathy, and the satisfied air of someone who had been given something valuable to pass along to someone else by afternoon. Meanwhile, In a less frequented corner of town, the vicar, Reverend Hopley, sat in his office staring at the church donations ledger with the particular anxiety of a man who feared that someone might soon ask him a question to which he did not know the answer. The ledger was balanced perfectly, too perfectly. Pages that should have contained the hurried penmanship of several different treasurers were written in a single careful hand. He closed the book very gently, as though it might accuse him of something. He would have liked to speak to Inspector Purbright. He would have liked even more not to. Sergeant Malley had, at this time, convinced himself that the matter of the candle was mostly resolved. He had told himself this 3 times, which usually was sufficient to settle his view of things. "So," he reported when Purbright entered, "no repeat incident this morning. Carberry says the church was empty and locked when he arrived." Purbright nodded, removing his coat with the efficient slowness of a man who thought before he reacted. "And the old boiler? Still troublesome, sir?" "He says it wheezes in a moral manner." Purbright allowed the faintest flicker of amusement. "Yes," he said quietly. "They often do." He set down his briefcase and regarded the neat stack of statements on his desk. Statements concerning dogs off leads, a dispute about a hedge boundary, and one letter complaining that the post office clock was deliberately fast in order to humiliate the punctual. Nothing in front of him, at that moment, suggested crime. But Purbright had been in Flaxfield long enough to understand that crime in such places did not arrive on horseback with banners. It arrived like mildew, quietly, in corners people forgot to look at. "Malley," he said at last, "go and have a friendly word with Mrs. Bray. Nothing official, nothing to alarm. Simply offer condolences belatedly in case she feels the town has overlooked her." Malley blinked. "Should I ask anything in particular, sir?" "No," said Purbright. "Only listen. People say most when they believe they are saying very little." That afternoon, Lydia Bray sat in her small front room, hands resting lightly in her lap, staring at the mantelpiece where her husband's photograph stood in its modest oak frame. His expression was polite, as though he had been asked to look interested in a conversation he did not fully understand. The room was quiet, not the natural quiet of peace, but the strained quiet of something carefully withheld. When the knock came at the door, she did not jump. She had expected it eventually, not the knock itself, but the world leaning in. She rose and smoothed her shawl before opening the door. Sergeant Malley, large and well-meaning, stood on the step. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bray. I hope I'm not intruding." She regarded him for a long moment. "No," she said gently. "Intrusion depends on intention," and she stepped aside to let him in. Inspector Purbright set out a little after 10 o'clock the following morning, the hour at which respectable people were most likely to be both at home and unprepared for visitors. This, Purbright well knew, encouraged honesty of a kind, not the grand confessional sort, but the small, involuntary truth of how a face reacts before the owner arranges it. He began, quite reasonably, not with the widow herself, but with those who believed they understood her, which in Flaxfield amounted to nearly everyone. Mrs. Carberry's sitting room, All Saints. Closed Mrs. Carberry answered the door with the air of one who had been expecting someone of importance, but was mildly disappointed to see who it actually was. "Oh, Inspector, do come in. Edwin said you might call. He's up at the church, of course, battling the boiler. I do hope it won't explode. The boiler, that is. Edwin tends to dramatize." Purbright followed her into a sitting room, heavy with ornamental cushions and the faint scent of lavender, matched with something sterner. Polish, perhaps, or disapproval. "We were very fond of Lydia. You know," she began, pouring tea in a manner that suggested each cup required justification. "Always so quiet, not one to draw attention." "Even now I believe she prefers solitude." Purbright offered a mild nod. Grief does sometimes encourage withdrawal, Mrs. Carberry sniffed thoughtfully. Oh, yes, certainly. But Lydia was always… Well, there were times when Harold would be at some parish event, and she would stand just behind him, as though ensuring he didn't wander. Wander? Purbright asked. Emotionally, Mrs. Carberry clarified, delighted by the delicacy of her own phrasing. Have you ever noticed how certain men hover on the brink of behaving irresponsibly, only to be kept from it by well-timed glances from their wives? Purbright decided not to inquire further. There was, he suspected, a long history of glances in the Carberry marriage. The municipal archives, town hall, upper corridor, the municipal archives were housed in a former schoolroom that smelled of dust, devotion, and an unspoken belief that record-keeping was next to godliness. Here, Purbright found Mr. Alban Creswick, Harold Bray's former colleague, deep in the act of refiling an entire cabinet in alphabetical silence. Terrible business, Creswick said before Purbright had spoken. Terrible. Bray was dependable. Thorough, upright. You could set your watch by him. In fact, I did. For 17 years, Purbright observed the man's meticulous hands, and the way his eyes did not leave the files even while speaking. You worked closely with him, Purbright said. We shared a desk partition, Creswick corrected, as though clarifying a matter of doctrinal importance. Bray was never one to socialize. No gossip, then? Purbright asked. Mr. Creswick drew himself up. Inspector, municipal record staff do not gossip. We discuss matters of procedural interest, such as… Purbright asked gently. Creswick paused, just long enough to reveal that the subject had, in fact, occupied him greatly. Well, there was a difference of opinion regarding charitable contributions, donations connected to the church? Yes. Bray believed certain funds were being allocated in ways that were unsystematic, a discrepancy in the ledger. Creswick blinked rapidly. Oh, no discrepancy, not now. It appears the ledger is quite correct, impeccably so, which, Purbright thought, was not at all the same thing. He thanked Creswick and left him to his alphabetical devotions. The market square, passing conversation. From the archives, Purbright took a slow route through the market. Flaxfield's market square was not large, but its geometry encouraged the spread of opinion. Voices travelled easily over cobbles, and once released, seldom found their way back to the speaker in quite the same shape. As Purbright passed, he heard, well, she must have been speaking to Harold's spirit, or to whoever she wanted him to think she missed. I heard she was seen buying 2 candles the day before the funeral. He did not pause. Flaxfield gossip was like wind. One could feel its direction without having to chase it. The widow's house. Late morning Lydia. Bray's home stood on a narrow terrace where ivy grew with the ambition of someone hoping to be congratulated for persistence. The curtains were half-drawn, not out of secrecy but of habitual politeness to daylight. Purbright knocked lightly. After a moment, Lydia opened the door. Her face carried no redness, no exhaustion, no drama, only a worn composure, as though emotion was something she had learned to fold neatly and place on a shelf. Inspector, she said, not surprised. Please come in. The sitting room was spare but tidy. 2 chairs, a small table with a cooling teapot, a framed print of Lake District hills, and the photograph of Harold on the mantelpiece, gazing past the viewer like someone awaiting instructions from eternity. Purbright took the seat she indicated. Sergeant Malley called yesterday, Lydia said softly. He was very kind. He's a kind man, Purbright agreed, sometimes almost to the detriment of persuasion. She smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. You have been visiting the church before dawn, Purbright said, his tone not accusatory but observational. Yes, for prayer? For conversation, she corrected, her voice gentle and steady. Purbright inclined his head. With your husband? Not exactly. She folded her hands in her lap. Silence settled. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. "When someone leaves," she said, "there are things we realize we have not said. We assume there will be time to say them later. And then there is no later." Purbright watched her carefully. "Mrs. Bray, is there something you did not say to your husband before he passed?" Her hands tightened just slightly. "There was something he did not say to me," she replied. "That was different, important." And yet she offered no elaboration. Purbright did not press. Pressing was almost always a mistake. Instead, he stood. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Bray. If you should ever wish to speak, I am easily found." She saw him to the door.
As he stepped outside, she asked, "Inspector,
"When you lose something, how do you know whether to look for it or to accept it is gone?" Purbright took several seconds to answer. "By noticing," he said, "whether what remains is silence or echo." She closed her eyes as though she understood exactly. Purbright walked back toward the station slowly. He now knew 3 things.
Lydia Bray was not afraid. Someone else was. Whatever had been unspoken in that marriage had not been erased by death, only delayed. And in Flaxfield,
Delays were rarely accidental. The vestry of All Saints' Church had been painted a shade of pale green that seemed determined to appear sickly under any lighting condition. No matter the time of day, it maintained the hue of unripe fruit and institutional despair. Reverend Hopley sat before his desk in this regrettable atmosphere, staring at the donations ledger as though it might spring up and accuse him of moral delinquency. Reverend Hopley was a gentle,
narrow-shouldered man in his mid-50s,
who always seemed slightly apologetic for having taken up space in the world. Parishioners found him comforting in the way they found lukewarm tea comforting, familiar and unlikely to provoke strong feeling. When Inspector Purbright knocked, Hopley started so suddenly that his chair squeaked in reproach. "Inspector."
"Oh, yes."
"Please, do come in." He immediately attempted to place several papers on top of the ledger in a manner that could only be described as strategically clumsy. Purbright, who had seen such movements many times, merely closed the vestry door behind him. "I wonder," he said mildly, "if you might spare a moment to help clarify a small matter of account-keeping."
"Only to satisfy my curiosity." Oh, certainly, certainly." Hopley smiled, the strained smile of a man wishing deeply to satisfy curiosity by extinguishing it. Purbright sat.
He did not look at the ledger. He looked at Hopley. "I understand Mrs. Bray's late husband assisted with certain church contributions." Hopley nodded eagerly.
"Oh, yes, Harold was most conscientious."
"Remarkably so. Too much so, perhaps." He gave a small, pained laugh. He believed righteousness could be audited. And was he correct? The Reverend made a small coughing sound, something between surprise and embarrassment. Well, one always does one's best to ensure funds go where they ought to go. Naturally, of course. His hands fluttered like startled scripture pages.
"But there was a time—"
"A year ago, perhaps, when our previous treasurer, a dear man, very dear man, but somewhat overwhelmed, left matters in a state that required—"
"Tidying." "Tidy," Purbright repeated quietly, a word with multiple possible flavors. Hopley swallowed.
"I assure you the accounts are entirely proper now." Purbright did not reach for the ledger. Instead, he asked, "Who handled the tidying?" The Reverend hesitated for half a second too long. "Mr. Leonard Fenn, he chairs the Business Improvement Committee." "You know him, of course." Purbright did. Everyone did. Leonard Fenn was that particular type of civic benefactor who contributed generously to public life while keeping careful track of who knew he had done so. His smile was always warm, his voice was always friendly, and his charitable acts were somehow always accompanied by a photograph in the local paper, even when no reporter had been present. "Mr. Fenn," Purbright said,
"is very helpful." "Yes," Hopley replied.
with the tone of someone describing an avalanche as enthusiastic. He insisted on helping us straighten the accounts. Insisted. So very kind. He was here at the church for many evenings.
Late sometimes? Was Harold here with him? Not always, but they
Discussed things, financial things. Often, Hopley shifted. Harold was troubled by some entries. He believed there were irregularities in how donations were
encouraged. And were there irregularities? No, Hopley said too quickly.
Not now. Not now, Purbright noted, was not the same as not then. Leaving the church, Purbright walked slowly along the path toward the high street. The morning had matured into one of those hesitant English days, uncertain whether to drizzle or brighten. The air carried a faint smell of earth and damp stone. 2 children were skipping rope near the churchyard gate, chanting something incomprehensibly rhythmic about hens and barrels and the Queen. Purbright listened for a moment, then continued. He did not head to the station. He headed toward the civic offices, where Mr. Leonard Fenn maintained an office that always smelled faintly of new carpet and self-satisfaction. The civic offices. Room 2B. Fenn rose the moment Purbright entered, extending a hand that managed to express warmth, confidence,
and subtle ownership of the conversation to come. Inspector.
A pleasure as always. Do sit. Coffee? We've just had a new machine installed. I've found it improves morale. Purbright sat, but declined the coffee. Machines that improved morale often did so in ways unrelated to taste. I understand, Purbright began, that you assisted the parish with its accounts last year. Fenn raised his eyebrows in pleased modesty. Oh yes, a small matter really. I dislike seeing community institutions struggling with unnecessary complications. One must be practical, Inspector. Faith is all very well, but numbers must add up. And they do now? Fenn smiled. Slow, confident, assured. Perfectly. He said the word perfectly in the same tone one might use to describe a well-trained spaniel. Mrs. Bray's husband was also concerned with the accounts, Purbright said. Fenn's smile did not fade, but it did cease to grow. Yes, Harold was a careful man.
A little fixated, perhaps. He leaned back.
He believed everything ought to live in balance.
Even people, he chuckled.
A quaint notion. Did you and he agree on methods?
Of course we did, Fenn replied too smoothly.
We both wanted what was best for the parish. A community must be supported, Inspector. People sometimes need
encouragement. Purbright regarded him.
Encouragement in the form of donations, Fenn steepled his fingers. I prefer to think of it as gentle civic guidance. A pause hung between them, not heavy, but expectant. Fenn broke it. Mrs. Bray is adjusting, I hope. She is managing, Purbright said. Yes, quite right. She's a delicate soul. Fenn's tone softened into something that might have been concern, or something rehearsed to resemble it. If she ever requires assistance, I hope she realizes she may depend upon me. Some people are not equipped to handle certain matters. Alone, Purbright watched him closely. There are statements that are kind, and there are statements that are possessive, dressed as kindness. This was the latter. When Purbright stepped back into the street, the drizzle finally made up its mind and began to fall with steady, fine determination. He stood for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, letting the rain stipple the pavement. 2 facts arranged themselves quietly. A ledger once irregular was now immaculate. A widow was speaking to someone who was no longer
alive, or someone who wished he were not discovered. The rain did not wash
away such things. It only made them easier to hear. There are some people who appear to embody helpfulness so thoroughly that one hesitates to ask why. Leonard Fenn was such a man. He gave generously to church repairs, sponsored the summer fete raffle, and once personally funded the repainting of the post office
door, an act recounted by Mrs. Lousby with the same reverence.
She reserved for royal weddings and 2-for-1 sales at the haberdashery. When Fenn appeared one afternoon at Lydia Bray's, doorstep with a basket of provisions, the sort that suggested a belief that grief was best treated with cheese and chutney. No one was entirely surprised, except perhaps Lydia. She opened the door slowly, and her face showed that quiet fatigue which looks less like exhaustion and more like being worn thin from maintaining civility too long. "Mrs. Bray," Fenn said warmly, stepping forward just enough to imply invitation, not enough to require it. "I thought you might be in need of a few things. One forgets to eat at such times." He lifted the basket, high quality, covered in a gingham cloth. Food arranged with the precision of a window display. Lydia offered a polite nod.
Thank you."
"That's very thoughtful." Fenn smiled as though gratitude were owed deeper than the words given. "May I come in?"
"Only for a moment."
"There are one or two practical matters I thought we might discuss." She hesitated.
"Only a fraction of a second."
But Purbright would have noticed it. However, no police inspector stood behind her now, and propriety still held its ceremonial power. "Yes," she said softly. "A moment." The sitting room, with its worn carpet and single gas heater, felt smaller when Fenn entered it, not because he took up much physical space, but because he acted as though the space belonged to him. He set the basket on the table with the confident care one uses when placing something into one's own kitchen. "You mustn't isolate yourself," he began, settling into Harold's old chair without asking. "Grief makes people vulnerable, leaves them open to suggestion, influence, missteps." Lydia stood rather than sit opposite him. "I am managing," she said. "Well, I'm sure you are." His tone suggested admiration for a child attempting a task requiring both height and tools. "But there are matters to handle. Utility accounts, property forms, certain things relating to Harold's place at the archives." At this, Lydia's eyes flickered, the smallest sign of something unsettled. "Yes," she murmured.
"There is unfinished business." Fenn leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Lydia, my dear, let me help you. Harold trusted me.
"We work closely on parish matters."
I only want what's best for you." The phrase, my dear, hung in the air like the smell of something that had been spilled long ago but never quite cleaned up. Lydia's voice,
when she answered, was quiet but level. "Leonard, I appreciate your kindness, but some things I must face myself." Fenn's smile did not fade. It simply tightened, "Of course."
"Of course." He rose, placing his hand briefly, too briefly to object to, too intimately to ignore, on her shoulder.
"But don't carry burdens alone longer than needed."
"People will talk, and they won't always talk kindly." He let that sentence settle like dust upon polished wood. Then, as though he had left nothing behind,
he collected his coat and withdrew politely into the street. Lydia remained standing for almost a full minute after the door closed, not moving,
not breathing,
watching where he had been. Meanwhile, Market Square. Late afternoon, Inspector Purbright was leaning against the stone wall outside the grocer's, speaking with Mr. Mossop, a man who had long ago appointed himself chronicler of local truths, accurate or otherwise. When he saw Fenn walking briskly up the lane, his expression composed in the manner of a man who has completed something. "Ah," Mossop said, following Purbright's gaze.
"The great benefactor, eh?"
"You know, Inspector, there's two sorts of generous men in this world. Those who give because they have enough, and those who give because they want something." "What do you suppose Mr. Fenn wants?" Purbright asked, not idly. Mossop scratched his nose as though consulting archives carved into bone. "To be owed," he said simply, "and to choose when the debt is collected." Purbright nodded once, then stepped away. The Garden Centre Cafe. Early evening. It was not coincidence that Purbright found Lydia Bray later that day at the Garden Centre Cafe. People in Flaxfield gravitated toward places where small talk could be conducted among potted geraniums. Grief especially liked gentle company, the kind that didn't insist upon questions. She was sitting alone, her tea cooling untouched. "Mrs. Bray," Purbright greeted, removing his hat politely Lydia looked up at him, not surprised. She gestured for him to sit. "I had a visitor," she said, before he asked. "Mr. Fenn," Purbright replied. A soft exhale, not quite a sigh. More like acknowledgement of something long expected. "He means to be helpful," she said, "or believes he does."
"Or wishes others to believe he does." "That," Purbright said, "covers most of the population." She almost smiled. They sat in companionable silence for several moments.
The kind of silence that acknowledged truth existed, even if it remained unnamed. Finally, Purbright spoke. "Mrs. Bray, there are those who say you have been speaking to someone in the church." Lydia did not flinch. "Yes." "Not to your husband?" "No." "May I ask to whom?" Her gaze shifted, not evasive, but inward, to some memory or presence, just beyond the reach of speech. "To someone," she said, Harold feared. The tea between them cooled untouched. Purbright did not ask more. It was too soon. He simply said, "If you ever feel you are being pushed, even gently, into anything you do not wish—"
"Please tell me." Lydia nodded once. "I will." But neither of them in that moment
believed she would. When Purbright left the cafe and stepped into the fading light of early evening, he paused, hands in his coat pockets, expression mild as ever. But his mind had arranged the pattern now, a perfect ledger that had once been imperfect. A man who offered help too readily. A widow who spoke not to the dead, but to the shadow of a threat the dead had left behind. The crime, if there was one, had not yet occurred. Or it had. Only no one had yet recognized it. The church hymn board, like most hymn boards in modest English parishes, served not only as an instrument of worship, but also as a convenient perch for items that ought to have been put away, but never were. Spare candles rested behind it. A folded leaflet advertising Lent talks had wedged itself between boards announcing hymns from 2019. A cobweb, having achieved tenure, hung with confident permanence. It was there, behind hymn numbers 143-58 and 302, that Mr. Edwin Carberry discovered the letter. He had been adjusting the hymn cards in preparation for Sunday, muttering darkly about the vicar's insistence on cheerful selections. When his fingers brushed paper, he unfolded it with the caution of someone who has
lived long enough to know that forgotten
items often become significant through no fault
of their own. The letter was addressed to
Mrs. Lydia Bray, 11 St. Wyston's Row, Flaxfield. The postmark, 8 weeks ago, 2 days before Harold Bray's death. Carberry stared at it for a full 10 seconds before retreating to the vestry, where Reverend Hopley was attempting to convince an uncooperative cupboard that it did in fact close. "Reverend," Carberry said, placing the letter down with the gravity of a medical diagnosis. This was behind the hymn board. Hopley stared, not with curiosity, but with recognizable dread. "Oh dear," he whispered. He did not touch the letter. The letter travels from Reverend Hopley to Inspector Purbright took just 20 minutes, including the time Hopley spent wringing his hands and apologizing to no one in particular. Purbright opened the envelope with a paper knife, not hastily, but with the steady attentiveness of someone unwrapping an answer he already suspected existed. The handwriting was neat, thoughtful, and unmistakably Harold Bray's. "My dear Lydia, I beg your forgiveness for putting these thoughts in writing, but the matter weighs heavier each day, and I do not know what may come. I have discovered something regarding Mr. Fenn's arrangements with the parish. I could not speak of it to you sooner, as I needed to be certain beyond doubt. I am certain now I have tried to address the matter through correct channels, but my efforts have been discouraged. There is something I must speak to you about before any formal step is taken."
"I must explain my reasons. I do not want you to think I have acted rashly. If anything happens—"
"Please remember I did what I believed was right. Yours, Harold Purbright read the letter several times, not for content, which was simple enough, but for tone. It was not the tone of a man plotting something, nor the tone of a man fearful. It was the tone of someone resolving himself, quietly, steadily, to a confrontation he knew would not be welcomed. This was the voice of a clerk ready to challenge a benefactor. A dangerous idea in a small town, more dangerous than shouting in the square. The vicar, speaks Hopley watched Purbright closely, as though one could observe a conclusion forming in another man's mind if one strained hard enough. "I should have brought it to you sooner," he murmured. Purbright looked up mildly. "You have only just found it?" "Yes, but I suspected something was wrong. Harold came to me once. He asked if I believed all donations were
freely given. And what did you say?"
The vicar closed his eyes. "I said it was not my place to question generosity."
"I regret that now." Regret, Purbright knew, seldom prevented anything.
But it sometimes illuminated why things had been allowed to occur. Lydia Bray's house, late afternoon. Purbright knocked. Lydia opened the door before he finished. She had seen him approach. No greeting was needed. She stepped aside. He handed her the letter. She sat down before opening it. She read it slowly, as though each sentence cost her something to understand. When she reached the final words, her hand remained resting on the paper, but her gaze had gone somewhere interior and shadowed. "He knew," she whispered. "Yes," Purbright said. "He was going to act." "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. And Harold was not a man who acted without thought. "No," Purbright agreed. "He was not." She looked up, meeting Purbright's eyes with startling clarity. Not grief now, but knowledge. "I was not speaking to Harold in the church," she said. "I was speaking to the one who knew why he died." Purbright did not respond immediately. Silence allowed truth to breathe. Finally, "You believe Harold did not die naturally?" Lydia's hands, resting lightly on her lap, did not tremble. Her voice did not waver. "I do not believe it," she said. "I know it." Flaxfield at dusk shops closed early that evening, though no one would later explain why. The post office clock ticked loudly enough to be heard outside. Mr. Creswick worked in the archives until after dark, rearranging files that were already arranged. The vicar sat in the vestry staring at the hymnboard long after he had extinguished the lights. Fenn, at home, poured himself whiskey with a hand that did not shake, because some hands only shake when watched. And Lydia Bray sat in her quiet front room, the letter before her, speaking aloud not to the dead, but to the knowledge the dead left behind. Purbright walks home. The inspector walked home slowly, coat buttoned against the evening chill. His step was not hurried. There was no urgency in his posture, but his thoughts had sharpened. A man discovers a financial impropriety. A benefactor intervenes. A conversation is promised. And then a man dies quietly, not dramatically, not violently, just at a moment that was useful. And now, a widow grieving not the loss of a man, but the truth he never had the chance to speak. Yes, the shape of the case had changed, but Purbright made no immediate move to act. Not yet. In Flaxfield, truth was something that had to be invited to step into the room, not dragged. The Garden Centre Cafe, with its pale wooden tables and abundance of potted ferns, was the closest thing Flaxfield had to neutral territory. Affairs both romantic and administrative had been concluded there over scones.
No one was ever accused in the Garden Centre Cafe, merely understood to have realized something. Inspector
Purbright chose a corner table where one could see both the entrance and the till, not because he expected drama, but because observation in Flaxfield was best conducted without appearing to observe. Lydia Bray arrived 5 minutes late. Not from hesitation, but from thought. She took the chair opposite him with the quiet composure of someone who has already decided what she will and will not say. The waitress, a gentle-eyed sixth-form girl who delivered tea as though handling relics, set down 2 cups. Lydia wrapped her hands around hers for warmth, though she did not drink. Purbright waited. It is often better to let silence begin the conversation than end it. At last Lydia said, "I should have known Harold was afraid."
I should have seen it.
But Harold always kept worry like a folded handkerchief, hidden until needed. "Did he tell you nothing?" Purbright asked. "Bits, thoughts, not enough to alarm. Just enough to confuse?" Lydia stared into her tea. The night before he went into hospital, he sat at this very table. He stirred his cup for nearly 20 minutes without drinking it. He said there were people who believed goodness was something they could purchase, and that generosity could be used as a lever. Did he mention Fenn by name?
No, he never named villains. Her voice softened.
He believed naming a thing gave it power. Purbright nodded. He had known men like that, conscientious to the point of fragility. "And the letter?" he asked gently. Lydia looked at him, a gaze steady and unsentimental. Harold wrote it because he believed someone might stop him. Stop him from exposing the irregularities?
No, Lydia said quietly.
Stop him from correcting them. Purbright absorbed that difference. If Harold Bray had merely uncovered wrongdoing, he might have been discouraged. But if he had intended to fix it, quietly, firmly, and properly, that would have threatened the pride of a man like Leonard Fenn more than exposure ever could. To correct someone publicly embarrasses them. To correct them privately wounds them, and wounded pride is dangerous in small towns. At that moment, the cafe door opened, and a gust of damp afternoon air accompanied Mr. Alban Creswick. The municipal archivist, he froze when he saw Lydia and Purbright, not dramatically, just enough to show that he had recognized the gravitas of the scene. "Oh," he said, adjusting his spectacles unnecessarily.
"I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," Lydia said,
though her tone suggested the opposite. Creswick stepped closer, clutching a manila folder to his chest like a hymn book. "I was looking for you, Inspector," he said.
"There is
something you should see." Purbright gestured for him to sit. Creswick sat stiffly, knees together,
hands still gripping the folder. "I've been reviewing the archive records Harold handled last month," he said. I thought I might learn what troubled him." "You were close?"
Lydia asked. Creswick considered this. "No, but he was the only person who ever asked why I stayed late. That was intimacy, in its own Flaxfield way." He opened the folder, revealing photocopies of receipts and donation slips, all bearing the tidy script of Harold Bray. "There was a fund," Creswick said.
"A discretionary one."
"For community improvement." Purbright said nothing. He had already suspected that. Fenn was its steward, Creswick continued. Money was given freely, yes, but some donations were
encouraged
from those who owed him favours, and some were returned to him later under different classifications. It was all technically legal, but Harold believed it was wrong. He meant to untangle it quietly, so no one would be publicly shamed. "And someone realized," Purbright said. Creswick nodded once. Lydia's hands tightened around her teacup. "If Harold had lived," she said, "Fenn would have owed him, not financially, morally."
"And Leonard Fenn does not like to owe." Creswick gave a small, tight breath of agreement. "Harold collapsed at work," he said. "Sudden, no warning."
"But the week before I saw him arguing with Fenn in the church porch."
"Not loudly, but intensely."
Fenn took Harold's arm.
"Not roughly, but firmly, as though reminding him of something." Purbright's eyes did not change.
But his mind did. "The conversation shifts, Mrs. Bray," Purbright said gently. You told me earlier you were not speaking to Harold in the church. You were speaking to someone who knew why he died. Lydia set her cup down carefully. Yes. To whom? Purbright asked. Her answer was quiet.
But unmistakable, to God, not as plea.
Not as hope, as witness. And I was not asking for comfort, she added. I was asking whether I must carry what I know or whether someone else will. Creswick stared at her in stunned admiration or perhaps fear. Purbright did not blink. You need not carry it alone, he said, something eased just slightly in Lydia's posture. But just then, the cafe door opened again, and this time it was Leonard Fenn. He stopped when he saw them. His expression did not flicker, but it paused, like a well-rehearsed pianist encountering an unexpected note. "My?" he said, with genial composure. "This looks like a significant gathering." No one answered. He looked at Lydia, not with sympathy, but with possession lightly disguised as concern. "You should be careful," he said softly to her.
This is not the time for...
Misinterpretation. Purbright rose, politely, calmly, the way one stands when about to seat themselves between a wolf and the fold. "Mr. Fenn," he said, "I believe we should talk, soon." Fenn smiled pleasantly, the smile of a man certain the room belongs to him. "Of course, Inspector."
I am always at your service. And with a nod to Lydia that lingered too long, he left. Not abruptly.
He did not need to. Men confident in their advantage leave. Slowly, Creswick exhaled shakily. Lydia looked at Purbright. Purbright looked at the door where Fenn had just been. Nothing louder than a teacup being set down occurred in that cafe. And yet, the investigation had just begun for 2 months. The death of Harold Bray had occupied no one's imagination. It had been, according to the doctor's report, a failure of the heart, quiet, unspectacular, the sort of ending one associates with clerks whose lives proceed in even lines. He had collapsed between 2 filing cabinets containing parish correspondence from 1954 to 1963, a placement no one remarked upon at the time, but which seemed oddly poetic now. Most of Flaxfield had moved on after the funeral. Grief here was generally allowed 2 weeks of public life before being tidied away into private corners. Lydia Bray had kept herself composed. The town admired her for it. Composure was considered a civic virtue, but now, quietly, politely, that composure had become a question. Inspector Purbright began with the doctor, Dr. Ambrose Prill. Surgery office, High Street, doctor. Prill was a kind man with a face shaped by years of listening to minor ailments explained with theatrical seriousness. His spectacles slid down his nose as though trying to escape the burden of patient stories. When Purbright arrived, Prill looked relieved, but the police did not usually cough at him or demand ointments. "Ah, Inspector. No complaints today, I hope?" "Not of the medical kind," Purbright said, taking a seat. "I wish to ask about Mr. Harold Bray." Prill blinked.
The late Mr. Bray?
"Yes," Prill folded his hands. "A sad business, but not mysterious. The man's heart was never robust. Quiet strain over many years can do that." "Strain?" Purbright repeated softly.
Of what kind?
"Oh, professional, personal, emotional, the usual varieties." He felt responsible for things. Prill gave a sympathetic half shrug. "Some men treat duty as a sack of coal. They carry it everywhere, even to bed." "Was there anything," Purbright said very gently, "that suggested the death might not have been entirely natural?" Prill hesitated. Not long, but perceptibly. "No," he said. "Nothing suggestive." Then after a pause, though I did note one detail. "Barely worth remarking." Purbright waited. There was a trace of digitalis in his system. Digitalis. Heart medication, Heyman poison at certain doses.
Not unheard of.
Not dramatic. Not proof, but not irrelevant. Was he prescribed it? Purbright asked. "Yes," Prill said. "In small amounts. Many are. And many use more when frightened. Did he seem frightened? Purbright asked. Prill considered. He seemed resolved, which is sometimes the same thing. The archives. Later, that afternoon, Purbright sat with Mr. Creswick at Harold's desk, still arranged as though Harold might return from an unusually long lunch. Creswick pointed to a drawer. "He kept this locked," he said. "Only Harold and I had keys."
"Not for secrecy, just order." Inside were labelled envelopes. Meticulous, unsurprising. But among them was something out of pattern. A small notebook, bound in dark green cloth. Purbright opened it. Not accounts.
Not confessions, observations, dates, times, small
Happenings. Fenn visited the vicar again after dark. 2.
donation pledges withdrawn suddenly, replaced next day. Lydia says there is always someone who benefits most from help. If something happens,
I hope she knows it was not cowardice, no accusation.
no dramatics, just the slow accumulation of unease turned into intention. Purbright closed the notebook. Creswick looked at him with a quiet,
Frightened intelligence. "You think he didn't die of his own heart?" he said. "I think," Purbright replied,
that Harold saw something he should not have seen, and someone else may have decided the world would be neater without him. Evening. Mrs. Lousby's sitting room. The town's gossip had reached a simmer, not boiling yet, but fragrant. Mrs. Daphne Lousby was relating to her bridge partner that Lydia had always been rather fragile, in the way one might describe a vase expected to break on schedule. "Well," Daphne said, "not that I want to imply anything improper, but you recall that Harold collapsed after confronting Mr. Fenn about the parish accounts." Her bridge partner gasped just enough to encourage continuation. "Oh yes," Daphne said. "Everyone knows."
"Only no one says." In Flaxfield, this was how consensus formed, not through evidence, through repetition. The widow's house, nightfall, Lydia Bray, was sewing when Purbright returned.
Not because the garment needed mending, but because her hands required occupation. She let him in with no surprise. "You've spoken with the doctor." She
said, "Yes," and Creswick, "Yes, she..."
placed the needle carefully on the
arm of the chair. "When Harold died," she said.
Leonard Fenn called the house before I'd even been told. He said he feared this might happen and that he was ready to assist me with any difficult affairs. Purbright stood very still. "That was considerate," he said. But the tone of his voice was so level it had no meaning at all. Lydia's eyes were steady. It was not consideration. It was preparation. She looked at the photograph of Harold. He feared Fenn, not as one fears violence, but as one fears misunderstanding. Harold believed that when powerful men are proven wrong, they do not correct themselves. They remove the evidence. Her movement was precise as she folded her hands in her lap. "I believe Harold was removed." The sentence sat in the quiet like a candle flame that had been waiting for oxygen. Purbright said nothing for a long time. Then gently, "May I ask why the church before dawn?" Lydia's answer was simple. "In daylight I am expected to endure. At dawn I am allowed to remember." Purbright walks home. Again, Flaxfield looked placid in the evening mist. Yellow lamplight pooling on cobblestones, curtains drawn against the cold, lives tucked neatly into their proper social drawers. But Purbright now knew. Harold had discovered ethical manipulation disguised as charity. Harold had been discouraged from addressing it. Harold had died. At a moment convenient to someone else, Lydia
had not been grieving ignorance. She had been grieving interruption, and
there was one more truth, small, almost invisible. If digitalis had played a role, it required someone close enough to Harold to influence his dosing, or his food, or his tea, someone who could speak softly, someone who could appear helpful, someone who believed themselves indispensable, someone like Leonard Fenn. But Purbright did not conclude, not yet. He simply placed the facts in their quiet places, like hymn numbers waiting to be chosen. Flaxfield was a town where truth rarely arrived in a shout. It arrived quietly, like dawn. The hour before dawn has a stillness unlike any other. It is not quiet in the sense of silence, but in the sense of held breath, a pause before the world remembers itself. Inspector Purbright had walked to All Saints' Church while the town slept. His coat collar was turned up against the gentle cold, his step soundless on the damp pavement. He did not hurry. Dawn has its own tempo, and one must match it. He positioned himself beneath the yew tree near the churchyard gate, a vantage point that allowed him to see both the main door and the vestry entrance. He could have stood closer, but Purbright preferred distance. People reveal truth more reliably when they believe they are unobserved. At 4:11 a.m. the mist was thin and blue. At 4:17 a.m. the faintest thread of gold began to loosen itself along the horizon. At 4:19 a.m. Lydia Bray appeared. She walked with calm purpose.
No stealth, no nervousness.
She carried no candle this time. Only her hands, held together in front of her coat, fingers interlaced, a gesture that belonged to prayer or to waiting. She unlocked the side door, the one that creaked during daylight, yet now opened without a whisper, and slipped inside. Purbright did not follow. He waited. Patience is the most underappreciated investigative tool in England. At 4:26 a.m.
Movement. Someone else approached the church, not cautious.
Not hesitant, Leonard Fenn. He did not knock. He did not call her name. He walked as though the building belonged to him, and as though Lydia Bray's presence there did too. He entered after her. Inside the church, not yet. Sean Purbright remained under the yew, still and unobtrusive. Only his breath moved. Dawn leaked slowly along the stone walls, catching in the cold iron of the gate. Time passed, long enough to measure a conversation, then a sound, not a shout. Not distress, just a voice, low and tight, like a string drawn too far. Fenn's voice. "You must understand, Lydia." It was unavoidable. Harold was going to make things difficult.
And I could not allow him to destroy what we've built.
The church's stone carried sound unevenly, so the rest came in fragments. Enough to know meaning, not enough to know words. Lydia's voice did not rise. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. Her tone, when it came, was clear as water poured from a jug. "Say it plainly." A pause, a long one. Then Fenn.
He put himself in the way. Not died, not fell ill, not passed, not was taken. He put himself in the way, which implied someone else moved. Purbright stepped toward the door,
but did not yet open it. He was not here for confession. He was here for understanding. Inside the church, the conversation, Lydia stood near the front pew, where morning light, just beginning, painted her face pale gold. Fenn stood too close to her, as though proximity alone could control truth. "You must stop dwelling on this," Fenn said gently. Very gently. The tone of a caretaker speaking to a nervous patient. Harold was always fragile. You knew that. I tried to guide him. "We all have our responsibilities." Lydia looked at him, not with grief, but with clarity. "You believed his conscience endangered your standing." Fenn's jaw tightened. He did not understand how the world works. Good requires management. Order, control. I have given this town what it never could have given itself.
"I have done good." Lydia's voice did not change.
"And when Harold refused to agree, you corrected him." Fenn took a slow breath. "If you repeat that, Lydia, people will misunderstand." "No," she said. They will finally understand. Purbright enters. The door did not slam, nor creak, nor announce his presence. He entered the church in silence, simply stepping into the nave the way dawn slowly steps into the windows. Mr. Fenn. Fenn turned. He did not jump. He did not flinch. He merely assessed. "Inspector," he said pleasantly.
"A very early hour for official business." "It seems a suitable hour for truth," Purbright replied. Lydia did not move.
Her hands remained folded. Purbright approached at the pace of conversation, not confrontation. "Harold Bray did not die because of weakness," he said quietly. "He died because he was about to assert integrity in a place where integrity had become inconvenient." Fenn smiled, or tried to. "Inspector, please." "You are extrapolating emotion into cause. The man was ill." "Yes," Purbright said, "but someone encouraged him to take more of his digitalis than prescribed." Fenn did not answer. Which was an answer. Purbright's voice remained gentle, the tone of a man asking whether a library book was overdue. "You believed that. Preventing a quiet correction was less harmful than allowing
"Embarrassment to fall upon you." Fenn's voice returned, controlled, low. "I have held this town together. I have given generously.
I have built a reputation that supports institutions everyone here depends on.
One misplaced accusation and everything fractures."
I protected us all." "You protected yourself," Lydia said. Fenn closed his eyes, just briefly, the way a pianist prepares for a final chord. "Lydia," he said, "you don't know what Harold was about to do." And Lydia, with devastating simplicity, replied, "Yes, he was about to tell the truth." The arrest Purbright did not raise his voice. He did not touch Fenn's arm. He merely spoke the necessary words with the dignity of someone announcing the end of a conversation. "Mr. Leonard Fenn, I must ask you to accompany me to the station." "Not. You are under arrest."
"Not yet. In Flaxfield, one does not shout crime, one simply names it." Fenn looked at Lydia, but not pleading.
Not apologizing, simply recognizing that she had been the one witness he could not manage. Then he nodded to Purbright, composed his coat, and walked. Purbright followed. Lydia remained because dawn had come, and she no longer needed darkness. The interview room in Flaxfield Police Station had the plain, unambitious quality of a room that had never been asked to contain drama. The walls were painted an inoffensive shade of beige. A single window admitted a modest square of daylight that seemed to arrive with permission rather than enthusiasm. Leonard Fenn sat with his hands folded neatly on the table. He did not appear nervous. He had the composed politeness of a man who had spent a lifetime being thanked for his contributions. Inspector Purbright sat opposite him. He did not open a file. He did not produce documents. He merely regarded Fenn with the quiet patience of a man watching a kettle that will boil in its own time. Sergeant Malley waited near the door, holding a notebook he had not yet opened. "Mr. Fenn," Purbright began gently. "You have been very generous to this town." Fenn inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement both courteous and proud. "You have funded repairs to the church roof, subsidized the fete, purchased new hymnals, and covered the shortfalls in council accounts at least twice." "Yes," Fenn said simply. "Flaxfield is worth preserving." "And you have encouraged others," Purbright continued, "to contribute to these efforts in their own ways." Fenn did not smile, but the air around him suggested one. A community must act together. People wish to belong to something larger than themselves. Purbright nodded. And some of these contributions were
voluntary.
Others were encouraged, sometimes strongly. Fenn leaned back, unoffended. "Encouragement is not coercion, Inspector."
"I've only ever asked people to do what they already knew was right." "And Harold Bray?"
Purbright asked quietly. Fenn's stillness changed, not visibly, but as a subtle withdrawal, like a tide pulling back from the shore. "Harold," Fenn said, was a good man,
a sincere man.
but sincerity can be naive. He believed principles existed in a vacuum, untouched by human complication. He believed the ledger should be accurate, Purbright said. Yes, Fenn replied, and I corrected it. The corrections were necessary. Purbright let silence settle, soft as dust. Harold intended to restore the ledger, he said, properly, quietly, without humiliation. That, Fenn said, his voice tightening imperceptibly, was the humiliation. Purbright did not react. He allowed Fenn to hear his own words. When a man attempts to undo the work you have built, Fenn continued, he is not simply disagreeing, he is dismantling. Harold did not see that. He believed himself righteous, as some men do when they have too much time and too little authority. Purbright kept his tone mild. So you persuaded him? Fenn's eyes flickered, one fraction of a second. I spoke to him, he said. I explained the harm. I reminded him that integrity must sometimes bend to the needs of community.
I did what was necessary to protect him from consequences he did not understand. And when he still meant to correct the ledger, Purbright said,
You helped him increase his own medication. Fenn did not look shocked, only disappointed that the world had failed to understand the elegance of his reasoning. It was a gentle correction, he said. Not violent, not cruel, simply guiding the inevitable toward its quiet conclusion. Malley finally opened his notebook, as though the moment had become official. Purbright did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked, "And Lydia?" Fenn's expression changed, subtly and completely. "Lydia," he said, choosing the name with care, "is delicate. I have always tried to protect her from grief, from loneliness, from unkind speculation." Harold was a fine man in his way, but he did not understand what she required. Purbright regarded him steadily. Which was? Someone, Fenn said softly, who could manage things quietly. There are confessions spoken in desperation, and there are confessions spoken in belief. This was the latter. Fenn looked almost serene. I have ensured the welfare of this town and of its people. I have prevented scandal. I have preserved reputations. I have carried burdens no one else could bear. If that is a crime, then I submit that morality is a luxury only the idle can afford. Purbright nodded once, a small gesture of finality. Mr. Fenn, he said, thank you, that will do. Outside the interview room, Sergeant Malley let out a breath he had apparently been holding for some time. Sir, he said in a low voice, I've never heard a man confess to something like that without ever saying the words. Purbright put on his coat, slowly. Most guilt, he said, believes itself virtue. When wrongdoing is done in the name of righteousness, the perpetrator rarely recognizes themselves as such. Malley frowned. Do you think Mrs. Bray will feel relief? Purbright considered the question. Relief, he said, is a quiet emotion. It does not announce itself. It waits. Lydia Bray, at home. That afternoon, Purbright visited Lydia, not to inform her, she already knew, but simply to be present. She was in the small front room, the sewing still on the chair arm, untouched. It is done? She asked, though she did not need an answer. Yes, Purbright said. She nodded once, a gesture not of triumph or victory, but simply of acknowledgement that a weight had shifted. Harold wanted, she said, only to put one thing right before the end. He did, Purbright answered. Lydia breathed, not deeply, but freely. That was all. No tears, no collapse, No proclamation. Grief does not conclude. It simply settles into a different corner of the room. And outside, the light shifted. Flaxfield resumed its rhythms. Not because the town did not care, but because life, insistently, stubbornly, kindly, continues. The following Tuesday dawned grey and unhurried, the sort of morning in which even the pigeons appeared reluctant to begin their daily negotiations over crumbs in the town square. Flaxfield, having absorbed the most recent ripple of scandal, was already beginning the gentle process of smoothing it into something like memory. News of Leonard Fenn's detention had moved through the town with admirable restraint. There were no outbursts, no dramatic exclamations, only the subtle realignment of conversational tones. In the post office queue, Mrs. Lousby remarked, "A pity, really. Such a helpful man." To which Mrs. Venn replied, "Sometimes help is just rearranged ambition." At the greengrocer's, Mr. Mossop declared it all a most inevitable surprise, which, coming from him, was practically understatement. The vicar, Reverend Hopley, preached a subdued homily that Sunday on the subject of good intentions performed loudly and true kindness performed quietly, though he declined to mention any names. He simply closed his sermon by suggesting that generosity should never require witnesses. Several parishioners nodded as if they had been thinking precisely that themselves for years. At the police station, Sergeant Malley was at his desk, sorting through a small avalanche of forms, none of which were titled "Moral Catastrophe in a Rural Community," though several might have benefited from the clarification. He looked up when Inspector Purbright entered. "Fenn's solicitor is asking about the timeline for formal charges," Malley said. Purbright hung his coat on the stand with habitual precision. "He may have to be patient." Malley blinked. "Sir?" "Some truths," Purbright said, "require documentation, and some require understanding. In this case, both." Malley nodded in the solemn manner of a man who understood perhaps half of what was said, but recognized the remaining half was probably important. "And Mrs. Bray?" he asked. Purbright's expression did not change, but something thoughtful passed behind his eyes. "She will continue," he said simply. "That is what the living do. Lydia Bray, at the church." Lydia visited the church at dawn again, only once more. There was no candle this time. No whispered conversation. She merely sat in the front pew, where the first threads of morning light gathered like shy visitors. She did not pray for Harold. She did not ask for healing. She did not speak aloud. She simply sat in the quiet, letting the silence settle into something companionable. When she stood to leave, she paused and placed her hand on the end of the pew, the gesture of someone acknowledging presence, not absence. No one saw her, which was, in that moment, the proper thing. The Garden Centre Café. 2 weeks later, Purbright found himself once again in the Garden Centre Café, this time accompanied not by grief or revelation, but by a modest pot of tea and a slice of fruit-cake that had clearly been cut by someone attempting to impress. The café was peaceful. Ferns, scones, small conversations. Flaxfield had resumed its ordinary weather. Lydia entered with a small bag of bulbs, daffodils from the look, and paused upon seeing him. Her expression remained composed, but not guarded. "Inspector," she said. "Mrs. Bray." She sat when he inclined his head toward the empty seat. They spoke of neutral things at first: the coming spring, the unreliable church boiler, the price of seed packets. Eventually, "Harold did not die for nothing," Purbright said. "It was not a question." "No," Lydia replied. "He died as he lived, quietly, and trying to do the right thing." The comment did not require response. After a moment, she reached into her bag and placed a single bulb on the table. small, plain, nothing ceremonious. "For your garden," she said. "Daffodils return every year without asking permission." Purbright accepted it with the same gravity he might have accorded an official document. "Thank you." They parted without lingering. It was not sadness. It was simply continuation. Life in Flaxfield goes on. The town council appointed a new temporary treasurer, a retired schoolteacher who kept the accounts with such transparency that they became briefly, dazzlingly dull. The parish ledger was no longer perfect, but it was honest, and that was, in its way, a restoration of the natural order. Mr. Creswick continued to work late at the archives, though now occasionally he allowed himself to leave early and go for a walk by the river. A small rebellion Harold might have encouraged. Mrs. Lousby found a new topic of interest, the quality of the bakery's new pastry crust. The town shifted easily to this subject, grateful for something that could be debated without moral consequence, and Lydia Bray planted spring bulbs along the small border of her garden, not as memorial, not as tribute, simply because things grow. Inspector Purbright. In his office late in the afternoon, when the station had settled into its gentle rhythm of paperwork and kettle boiling, Purbright sat at his desk. He was not writing a report. He was not reviewing statements. He was simply sitting, as one sits after restoring balance to a crooked picture frame. Sergeant Malley approached, hat in hand. "Sir, do you ever worry the town doesn't see the truth of these things as clearly as it should?" Purbright considered. "No," he said. "Truth is not obligated to be seen, only to be known." Malley nodded slowly, unsure but respectful. Purbright looked out the window at the quiet street, where nothing special seemed to be happening, which often meant everything was as it should be. He reached for his pen. There were reports to complete. Routine ones, the comforting kind. The world, having tilted, had settled again.